Hi, and thank you for listening to Memoria's 6-series podcast, The Loss of a Loved One. After the most difficult of years, we have created this series to help those that have been directly impacted by the loss of a close family member, a good friend, or member of our own local community. In the previous episodes, we looked at the impact of loss. We covered modern day choices in funerals, and episode 3 was a very moving production on bereavement with some heartfelt personal stories. In episode 4, we looked at 3 aspects of the funeral industry: the traditional funeral from the Victorian age, the changes this century and the impact of the past year on the industry, and how these changed attitudes will alter family choices in the future. The penultimate episode looked at the area of officiants, in particular the role of the celebrant, and the issue of families being able to select their own personal representative. Today we close this series with the subject matter of hope. The title of this episode is the shortest of our episode titles, but is arguably the most important of this series, a production created to help those that have been directly affected in what has been for many a year that will have impacted hugely on their lives. When you experience loss, there normally follows a process, and in the past year it has not always been possible for this process to be the way the deceased or their loved ones left living with loss would have wanted. Funerals were often difficult to organise, and very sadly at the height of the pandemic, demand was so great that the industry could not meet everybody's needs. Even when families were able to get a funeral arranged, the number of mourners was restricted, and in the past year over 2.5 million people would not have been able to attend a funeral of a family member or close friend. A huge number of children and younger people have lost parents, grandparents, aunties, uncles, cousins, and close family friends and neighbours. As we hopefully overcome this pandemic, we will have to face the very harsh realities that there are going to be a worryingly high number of people throughout the world that are going to need lots of support to come to terms with their loss and the events of the last 12 months. People will, as we come out of the darkness, be trying to find help, counselling, bereavement support, and the strength to carry on, to live with the sadness, the human emotions that are natural when your life has been so suddenly, often unexpectedly changed. Today, in this final piece of our podcast series, I am again so pleased to be joined by Lucy Hurd, bereavement rights campaigner and grief recovery specialist. Lucy is the creator of Jack's Law and the founder of Grief and a Cuppa. And Laura Toop. Laura Toop is a major life transitions coach specialising in loss, bereavement and health. Laura is the founder and owner of Bridging the Gap and the Loss Connection. Lucy, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm sure many of our listeners will know you from the media coverage after your very young son died, but as many people who will have found our series will not, can I ask you to explain today what happened to your family and how the legacy was created, what we all know now as Jack's Law?
Thank you, Frank. Yes, well, firstly, thank you for inviting me onto this podcast of yours. And thank you for letting me share my story about Jack. So, as you mentioned, tragically, my son Jack died 10 years ago, just before his 2nd birthday. It was a hot summer's day in August in 2010, like any other normal day. And it was a day that my world stopped, I suppose, is the best way to explain it. When they told me that Jack wasn't going to survive, me, my family, friends, we just crumbled. I think, like quite a lot of people that have experienced grief, it's where your world stops for that moment and then for quite a long time afterwards. But for me, I wanted to make a change. I first-handedly discovered that there was no law to let people take time off from work, and I felt that was an unjust. And my own personal family could either take 24 hours off, some were given 3 days off. And I think the most somebody was able to take off was 3 days, and one of those had to be the funeral. I'd come from an IT background, so I'd never worked on campaigning before. But I remember going to speak to a local MP, asking him how I should create legislation, because I wanted to ensure that no other family was told that they couldn't take time off from work to grieve a loved one. I'm sitting down there and I said to him, what do I do? And he said, you need to create a petition. And I said, okay. I said, well, how many signatures do I need? And he said, you need 100,000. And I remember looking at him thinking, well, I have only got about 150 friends on Facebook, so this is going to be quite a tricky journey. But okay, but that's what I've got to do. That's what I've got to do. But all the way through this, I had to support my own children, my own grief. I had my parents lived 350 miles away. Sorry, excuse me. And I thought, well, if I'm going to get through this, I need to find something to do. It was the reason why I did my campaigning was because I actually went to look for support after Jack died, and I was told I had to wait 42 weeks before I could speak to anybody, because there was such a large waiting list. And unfortunately, there are waiting lists that you have to go on, but then there are also other sort of charities and things that might not necessarily have waiting lists for you to speak to somebody. But I had to wait 42 weeks, so I thought, well, the only way I'm going to be able to carry on with my life is to find something else to focus on. So I focused on trying to create legislation. So for 10 years, I plodded along, finding signatures and asking people to sign my petition and talking on various media stations and on television, sharing my story about Jack, and just kept on going as hard as I could do. I never imagined that I would be sat here today talking to you and to others about the one thing that kept me going through everything over the last 10 years, and that was hope. I had to keep hope in my heart that one day something would become better. So, yes, wow. It seems pretty intense when you start saying it out loudly.
It does. Lucy, I mean, it's so important to share these stories. So for me, I think that, my 5 years in the industry has taught me that there's no magic wand when you're feeling in such a bad place, and listening to people that have actually been on that journey and taken the right turns, it's so important. Can I ask you a little bit more? When you were told you would have to wait 42 weeks, who was it that delivered that news to you?
I'm not going to name and shame.
Was it the NHS?
No, it was a bereavement charity. They had a very large waiting list, and I was at the time living in a small, sleepy town in the Lake District, and there weren't many bereavement charity support in my area. So the ones that were there had a tremendous lot of people to support and look after. So for me, in my local area, that's why there was such a long wait of 42 weeks. But I had spoken to other people over the years, and there does seem to be a bit of a problem, is that sometimes there is too long a waiting lists. But when you said about did I get that information from the hospital? No, when I actually left the hospital, I was given a leaflet, and that was it. So I said goodbye to my son, left the hospital with a leaflet, which almost felt, there you go, off you go, see you later, go and discover what you can on your own.
It's very hard to believe that, in 2010, so we're sort of quite a long way into the 21st century. I know from my own experience that my mum, she lost a child. She had a stillborn after me back in the 60s, and those of us that have watched some of those dramas on the telly will know, not with any real surprise, that historically there was a sort of a lack of understanding and a lack of help in those far off days. I mean, I think my mum was told, never mind Grace, off you go, just go back to work, we'll sort this out. And that was it. But I don't expect it in 2010, somebody just to be given a leaflet and sent home. It seems quite amazing that, in such a high-profile society, in such a modern westernised country, that that they would leave you like that. Can I ask you, You mentioned that my world stopped. Now, when these situations very sadly happen, we find out a lot about ourselves very quickly, and your world stopped, and you obviously found out about your inner self in terms of strength and courage. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, no, interesting. Yeah, my world did stop. The day that Jack died, the old Lucy died. And I think that's why sometimes people find it quite difficult talking to a bereaved person, because they're not the same anymore. Not only do you have to adapt to the new you, but friends and family adapt to the new you as well. So I often describe that my heart broke into a million pieces on the day that Jack died. And I think that's probably why I describe it as that my world stopped. I still had to be a mum, but Lucy, who was the carefree, happy-go-lucky person of 2000 and before August 2010, was no longer there. She had to rebuild herself.
That's absolutely amazing. How did you discover the laws on bereavement leave? I mean, at what point did somebody sort of say, I'll probably get this wrong now, but never mind, but you're entitled to 3 days off? Where did that come into the story?
So, like I said, I mentioned my immediate family. I needed them. I was 350 miles away from my family, and they all had to go back to work. So when they'd all contact their workplaces, they were told various different levels of what they could take. Thankfully, my mum was a school teacher at the time, and her school gave her sick leave off. So actually, she still had to sign off, but she didn't have to. She wasn't given those 2 weeks off or 3 weeks off, or however long she needed to spend that time with me and my children. I just couldn't believe that. Was it just our family that had experienced that? Was it just our family that were told that they couldn't take time off after a bereavement? And the more I shared my story over the years, more and more people shared their own experiences of what happened when they'd lost a loved one, and then were told they had to come back to work within 24 hours, 3 days, or whatever it might be. So when I started this campaign, it was never about for the death of a child. It was the death for everybody. It was the death for a husband, a wife, a grandparent, a parent, sibling. But I was unable to go down that route straight away from something that was nothing. Not many businesses like change. So I had to build a prototype. And the prototype became Jack's Law. But I'm actually continuing now in conversations to try and amend Jack's Law to include all family members, so that families can go to work, and if they need to take time off, that they can take time off.
Well, what you've done is absolutely amazing, and for the benefit of our listeners, if you just like to Google Jack's Law, or indeed Google Lucy Hurd, you will find out much more about that. Thank you so much for sharing, Lucy. I'll come back to you later on. Laura, thank you so much for joining us again today. Laura, you and I have engaged a lot through social media, so I know some of your story, being widowed at a very young age and the subsequent challenges that life presented. For the benefit of everyone, perhaps you can share today exactly what happened when you first knew your husband was going to die, your immediate thoughts, your longer term thoughts, if that was at all possible at the time, and the eventuality, and your journey from then until now.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Frank. And thank you for allowing me to be part of this Memoria podcast. I'm really very grateful of that. Thank you. So my journey, I guess it was back in January 2014 when things began to get a bit off track. Chris, my husband, already had type 2 diabetes, but now it was that he couldn't seem to get it under control. They gave it this diagnosis of, 1.5 type diabetes. Frankly, I don't think there is such a thing, but the doctors were trying to reassure us. By July, they decided it was because of an unhealed wound. His blood sugars were all over the place, so a minor operation was carried out to deal with it surgically. Just routine, nothing untoward. Bang, 24 hours later, and Chris is severely jaundiced, and no one understands the cause. A whole series of tests carried out, and other than the obvious yellowing from the jaundice, Chris was fine. I went back to work, carried on with my stuff. The day of the consultant's appointment, I wasn't there. I was up in Norfolk on business. And because he said, oh no, I'll be fine, I'll go with my sister, I'll be fine, it's nothing to worry about. So I went off and just, wasn't left him to it really. The day came to an end, and obviously I was starting to get slightly apprehensive about what had gone on. And I took the call, and I remember it just as if it was yesterday. I sat there where he just said, it's not good. And my heart just dropped. I have pancreatic cancer. It was like literally the life had been sucked out of me. I was in absolute shock. I don't recall any tears, just utter body numbing shock, being barely able to move, to breathe. I'd been due to meet a colleague later that evening for dinner. I think I just about remembered how to text a message to say I was going to be delayed. And I think I must have spent the next 2 hours in the car park just in utter shock. In that moment, my life as I knew it was irreversibly changed. Cue treatment, we got married. The tumour didn't grow. The treatment seemed to be doing some stuff. I wasn't getting bigger. And we were offered the opportunity of a Whipple procedure, which is a major 13-hour surgery, which was all successful. The consultant came out and said, well, it was a bit further ahead than we thought, but don't worry, go away and have a nice 10 years of your life. 3 months later, and we are heading back to hospital for what actually turned out to be the last time. Before we did, I remember very vividly sitting on the sofa and him making me make 3 promises to him. One of which was to move on with my life, whatever happened, which is fine, if you're not the one that's left behind without the love of your life. Sadly, once we went back to hospital, Chris deteriorated pretty rapidly. It was actually 9 days in all, and Chris died in the early hours of the 9th of July 2015. I felt absolutely and utterly hopeless and helpless. There was much to do, the death certificates to obtain, notifications to be made, the employer, blah, 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 blah. And of course, a funeral to arrange. Not much time really to take a pause. My mind was suitably active and definitely busy in bereavement. But funeral over, and bang, I'm in A&E, serious amounts of pain. They discover a minor urinary infection just before they were about to discharge me. So it kept me in for 12 hours of observations. Within 3 hours, I too was severely jaundiced and my liver function was off the scale. I was seriously, seriously ill myself and experiencing all the symptoms that my husband had done before he died of pancreatic cancer. Before I knew it, I was whisked away to a room on my own, tubes placed in more parts of my body than I knew actually existed, as I struggled to breathe and feared I too had pancreatic cancer, only I was facing it alone.
Thank you, Laura. After all of that, your serious illness yourself, and when you arrived back home, I know that you don't have children. Can you remember the sort of first time you got back home, you didn't have family or friends around you, and the doors closed that first night when you're faced with trying to look ahead? I mean, tell us a little bit more about that.
I think, it's as I say, you feel utterly hopeless and helpless because the first question, and then I remember vividly when, even before Chris had been removed from the hospital room, saying to him, how am I going to cope? How am I going to cope? And over again, because how am I going to cope without your support? I'm going to be all on my own. And feeling, like I say, utterly hopeless and helpless. I just didn't know how I was going to cope. Yes, I had my family around, but they have their own lives, they have their own responsibilities. And so it was definitely a case of kind of feeling like I was wading through treacle in a parallel universe to everybody else. And that, here I was, I kind of pushed on through to go back to work, but actually, whilst I'd been off, I had got a new boss who'd been promoted above me. And should we say we didn't necessarily see eye to eye? And behind closed doors, he didn't make it particularly pleasurable experience for me. So the one thing that I did know, and that had previously given me great comfort, was now also causing me great pain, suffering with still the after effects of being really, really poorly. And you can't, until it happens, I don't think anybody can truly grasp the extent of what is affectionately referred to as widow brain or widow fog, which is just the body's natural response system kicking in from the sheer stress, trauma, and experience that you've been going through, and saying you need to slow down. And it's automatic. It's nothing you can control about it. It's like an exhaustion you have never felt before, which is why I say it is like walking through treacle. And coupled that with the jaundice, trying to string a sentence together. I mean, I sound exceptionally eloquent now relative to me not even being able to understand what sequence of words I needed to put together to make a sentence. Trying to cope with all of that was just horrific. So by the time I got to the end of 2015, I myself had major surgery to try to resolve the issue that had caused me to be in hospital for a month. I had been let go of my job because, as I say, we didn't see eye to eye. And there I was, facing that Christmas and, a new year with the prospect of what? Nothing. Indeed, ironically, my then 4-year-old nephew said to me, "Auntie Lollipops," aka me, "now that Uncle Chris is dead, you have nothing." I mean, he did indeed feel like I had nothing, and he did, however, say he'd look after me for 100 days, bless him. But, that's fine if you're 4, but if you're 42, not so great. So I was kind of lost in this world I'd not asked for, I didn't recognise, I had no clue how I was going to step forward. So 2016 felt pretty bleak. I sort of stumbled into a relationship with a guy I quite liked, who then, out of the blue and completely unexpected by myself, cut it off and said he didn't want to step into the shoes of my husband. I didn't want him to step into the shoes of my husband. So I just felt even more broken by that point, I think. And it was one of those things where I just needed the world to stop. I had to find some way to slow myself down. So I knew from past experience, one of the ways I do slow myself down is to go and sit in sunshine. So I had to find guaranteed sunshine somewhere in the world that I would slow down and I could find some hope again. So 5,000 miles away, I found sunshine on the beautiful Caribbean island of Aruba. So there I was, as I stepped off the plane, I was welcomed by the taxi driver who said, "Welcome to the happy island." So the irony was definitely not lost on me as I blubbed my eyes out on the sun lounger for the best part of 6.5 weeks. 2 weeks passed. I mean, I was only ever meant to be there 2 weeks, although I ended up staying for 7. But 2 weeks wasn't long enough. So I threw all caution to the wind and said, "Right, I'm not coming back. I've got more of my life I need to sort out. Don't know what it looks like, but I'm staying a bit longer." And actually, the tears did dry when I started to change the question from how am I going to cope to what am I coping with. That was, for me, the turning point. Because how can I find the how if I don't know what I am coping with? I had to work out what it was that I was dealing with now. And at that point, that was when things that I really took a shift in how I could move forward. These three questions, I don't really know why I asked myself these three questions. Don't ask me why I did, but these three questions have now become the basis on which I rebuilt my life and the life I have now. And I scribbled these questions down in my sketch pad, which frankly was just filled with words. Who am I now? What is important to me now? And what makes me feel truly alive? Because I desperately wanted to feel alive. And I think in that kind of moment, it was suddenly my life started to regain some sense again. And as I affectionately recall it, Project Me was born on a beach in Aruba, May 2016. So roll forward 5 years. Those three questions have become the basis of me moving 90 miles around the M25, buying a house in a town I didn't know, renovated that house into a home, made friendships far deeper than I have ever had before, and retrained and set up a business I am passionate about and offers me this careful balance of work and me time. Has it been easy? No.
I think that's there's some really good points in there. Project Me, I like that. But I think there's some really important points in there as well for everybody listening, which is let me find out what it is I'm trying to cope with as against how am I going to cope. I think that itself is important. Thank you. Laura, Lucy, you will both understand the dark place that many listeners are in right now. Both of you have travelled on the bereavement road, and you know the right turnings to take and the type of support and guidance that is available. As we now draw this series to its conclusion, what would you say to those listening that have suffered a loss this past year? Lucy, I will ask you first, and Laura, if you could give us your thoughts after Lucy.
I suppose at times grief can feel so overwhelming. And I suppose what I've learned is that you don't need to live with the pain of grief. You can get help and do something about it. So the actions for me I took were using the grief recovery method. It released me from the shackles of pain and enabled me to carry on living in a way that honours the memory of my son. Everyone grieves differently. There's no right way. There's no wrong way. It doesn't matter whether it's been 6 days, 6 weeks, 6 months, 6 years, or 60 years. Grief is grief, and you have to go through it. You can't avoid it. But there's always hope. And I think keeping hope in your heart, as small as it might be at a time of your darkest days, it gets brighter as you go along. So now when I think of Jack, I don't have the painful memories associated with him anymore. People often say that when I talk about Jack, my eyes light up and I smile from ear to ear. And for me, that was because I trained to become a grief recovery specialist and did the method with them. So yeah, I think that's probably what I can say to people. But look for the help, even though I had to wait. Well, I was told that I had to wait all that time at the beginning. There is hope out there. There is people out there. There are organisations. There's people that can help you one-to-one. But having the support and the help and the advice in place will make your journey unique to you, but it'll maybe guide you of where you should look, and not be like me and look at a brick wall and think, now what do I do? And so, yeah, I think that's for me, really. But so the other thing which we've spoken about, Frank, is the bags of hope. I'm hoping that all funeral directors and celebrants and anybody that's involved within the funeral industry will be able to have a bag of hope and give them to bereaved families so that they can look for those solutions and look for that help, that they don't have to walk out of a hospital or out of some other sort of a care home and think, now what do I do? And don't just have a piece of paper or just a little booklet. I said, there are hundreds and hundreds of people that can help you across this country. Yes, so the bag of hope really will give you the tools and the the hope that
word
something.
keeps coming up, and really, really wise words there. Grief is grief. 6 years or 60 years, grief is grief, but there's always hope. Laura, your thoughts?
I echo many of Lucy's thoughts. Is it 6 years, 6 months, 6 weeks, 60 years? Grief is grief. I think, to add to that, the first thing I would say is, most importantly, to breathe, to take a pause, not to push on through. It is unhelpful when it comes down to loss and grief. The unexpected shock which sends the mind and body into place you've never experienced before, the exhaustion and the confusion, you just can't push through it. You need to slow the pace down. You need to absorb where you're at, and know that in putting you first is the most important thing that you can do, in terms of giving you a strong foundation in order which to build on for the life that you are now moving forward into. Trying to be things to all people, and putting yourself last doesn't give you the firm anchorage that you need in this space beyond loss. It does take action, and Lucy talks about the support that she didn't have access, and I didn't actually have access to either to start with. It was probably 3 years before I realised support was out there. But one thing that I talk about often is that in order for grief to become more palatable, shall we say, action does need to be taken. It doesn't matter how quickly. It's not about the speed. It is about taking small steps. I liken grief to a teaspoon of salt in a teacup of water. When it happens, it's extremely unpalatable, terribly nasty. You just want to ignore it, pretend it's not there. But with a little bit of time, and more importantly, action in the adding of water, we can make it a little bit more palatable. With a little bit more action and a little bit more water added in, we need to change the vessel, because we need something bigger. The salt's never gone, the grief never disappears, but it has become more palatable, and we can carry it on with us in a way that allows us to have hope and a future that is living with the grief of the loss.
Thank you, Laura. Hope and the future, very important words. Thank you both so much. Finally, my celebrant friend Maggie Hutchinson, who some of you would have heard on our last episode, sent me this today. Following the dark and hopeless despair of grief, the road ahead is unknown and frightening. Hope is a simple word representing so much. It can mean the difference between hanging on and giving up. During this series, our participants have shared some heart-rending personal stories which saw their own worlds and lives torn apart. But they found the strength and courage to not only recover, but use the wonderful memories of their loved ones to create legacies to some very special individuals. They know what it takes to go on, and can share and help if you are feeling low, weak, or struggling with life. Please do contact them if you would like to discuss anything further, or contact me directly. My details can be found at memoria.org.uk. I sincerely hope that you have found our production helpful and informative. We would be very grateful for your feedback and any questions you might have, and my contact details again can be found at our website. Thank you again for listening.